I'm at a student desk here, which is very good since we're all beginner. You know, should have beginner's mind when we do this, that expression, you know, we're always starting anew. We should be seeing anew without any, you know, mental categories and a prioris and all those things. It's part of what we're trying to break through when we do Zen, so we can see with like pure eye. So, you know, I was told by your officers that one of the things you've been talking about is recently is no self, the Buddhist doctrine of no self. So I thought I would, in fact, talk about that, because it's quite a fascinating topic and quite fascinating experience when you actually have it. Of course, you don't have it if you have it at that point, because there's no self. You can't talk about it. When I was touring Vietnam a few years ago, our guide was a Theravada Buddhist from Thailand, and he kept saying to us, dukkha, anicca, anatta. And he kept, you know, insisting that that was the truth of reality. And those are the three primary words in Pali, you know, to describe Buddhist metaphysics, which is dukkha, which is that, you know, everything is suffering, that first noble truth, meaning, you know, life is basically inadequate, insufficient, you can't hold on to it, you know, it causes distress, how do you get out of it? And the rest of the noble truths are how you get out of it. And anicca, which means impermanence, which is one of the dimensions of this inadequacy of life. Things are impermanent, you can't hold on to them. So you have to face that truth. But then perhaps the most radical is the anatta, which is no self. Related to the Sanskrit word Atman, you know, Atman, Brahman, you've probably heard of that, where your Atman, your soul, is the absolute Brahman. In Pali that's Atta, so An-Atta means no self. So what does that, you know, actually come down to? Well, I'm going to use a couple of koans to illustrate an approach to this. We'll approach it from a couple of angles here. In the Mumonkan, which means in Japanese a gateless gate, one of those lovely Zen paradoxes, a gateless gate. In other words, there's a gate that you go through, but there's no gate, there's no obstruction there except what we place there. It's wide open, just go in if you can. Anyway, it's the most accessible collection of koans that teachers often start with their students. As often, you have a couple of, you know, contradictions in one koan to another. Basho, who is a great master in the 30th koan, says, this very mind is the Buddha. Buddha being reality, you know, basic awakened reality. So this very mind, in other words, mind, is Buddha. Consciousness. But whose? Whose consciousness? What is that like? Because only a couple of koans later, 3 koans later, the same master says, no mind and no Buddha. He'd like to negate it. So he was asked in his own time, you know, you're saying 2 different things here, apparently. What do you mean? So he said, well, I say mind is Buddha. It's like something you would say to a baby who's crying. So someone who's full of the dukkha, the suffering of life, like a baby crying and still very young, in wisdom, needs to be given this pacifier, which says this mind, you know, very mind is Buddha. But when the baby stops crying, he said, when you made a little bit of an advance, then you're ready to hear no mind and no Buddha, which sounds nihilistic, but by then you should know that it's not. It's liberating. So no mind in the sense of this, your mind is not what we're talking about. Nor is your idea of what Buddha is, or some isolated individual Buddha, what we're talking about. So no mind and no Buddha. And of course, if you do koans, then you sit with that for 10 years and see what comes of it. They're very similar. In fact, I just noticed this myself when I was preparing for this. Very similar is Nansen, who was one of the really great Chinese masters, great master of the Absolute, has something very similar. In his in the 27th koan here, Nansen says almost exactly, not mind, not Buddha, not things. So nothing really. Emptiness. So we're starting from the other end here. We're going from the not, the negation part. But then, a few koans earlier, the same master in 19 says, something like Basho said at first, ordinary mind is the way. Of course, the whole thing is, what does ordinary mean? Not ordinary in the sense of customary, but ordinary in what's really natural when you really get there. It's funny how what's really natural is hard to find. But he says ordinary mind is the way. Now, what's curious or instructive about this one is it's a little longer. After he says that, this is going to take us a step further here. He explains it to his student Joshu, who was my favorite Chinese master and became a great master himself. He says, when you have really reached the true way, beyond doubt, you will find that it is vast and boundless as outer space. So whenever we're talking about Buddha or mind or no Buddha, that's what it's like and that's what it feels like. This is vast and boundless as outer space. I mean, how liberating, how marvelous. So that's what it is. How can it be talked about? He goes on to say, but you can't talk about it. But it was enough, according to this koan, that was Joshu's moment of enlightenment. When he heard that, somehow it clicked. And that's kind of what we're all waiting for, to be able to have it click. Well, to get a sense of what this vast and boundless actually is, why don't we look at the Buddha's own enlightenment? And that experience is not recounted in many koans. The clearest one is the Denkoroku, the record of transmitting light, which is one of the later collections. And the very first one, of course, because it goes through all the patriarchs in succession, down to the writer's own time in the 12th century. But it starts with the Buddha himself, Shakyamuni, the historical Buddha. And you may know the story of his enlightenment. It's quite dramatic. He goes through a whole night of temptations, kind of like Christ in the desert. And then, as the morning star rises, he's sitting under the Bodhi tree, the enlightenment tree. He wakes up, becomes the Buddha. That's what it means, as you know, the awakened one. And what does he say, according to the koan? He says, I and the great earth and all things have at once achieved the way. So notice this, what the content is at the moment of enlightenment. I and the great earth and all things together have achieved the way. The way being reality. So I and the great earth and all things are reality. So it includes everything. It's vast and boundless. It includes everything. And as the commentary indicates, the I who sat down under the Bodhi tree the evening before is not the same I that woke up and said, I and the great earth and all things have achieved the way. So whose mind is it? It's not the ego mind, the isolated mind. It's the vast and boundless Buddha mind. The Buddha, Shakyamuni became the Buddha then. So, ordinary mind, that's what it means, but it's no mind, according to what we understand mind. So the real vast and boundless consciousness includes everything and redefines what we mean by I. So, it is I. If you look at the Blue Cliff Record collection, the 7th one of the monks says, my name is Eko, what is the Buddha? And the master says, you are. Because you and you and you and all of us are the Buddha, but who are we? It's not just my name, my individuality. It's an invitation to wake up to that vast and boundless reality that we are. One of my favorite koans for illustrating that is in the 68th of the Blue Cliff record. I'm going to change the names because it gets confusing in Chinese. We'll change it to Jon and Brian. So Jon and Brian are sitting together, and Jon says to Brian, "Who are you?" Which is a very good question. Don't answer too quickly. Who are you really? So it's a trick question, as all the koans are. And Brian's up to it. So he answers Jon, "I'm Jon." Brian says to Jon, "I'm Jon." And then Jon says, "Well, I'm Jon." And then Brian says, "Well, I'm Brian." So they came down to, they came down to earth again. And we have to live on this world, with our labels. But at that moment before, Brian said he was Jon, and he was right. Because I and all things in the great earth have simultaneously achieved the way I and all people are the one Buddha, the one Buddha mind, the one Buddha consciousness. So there's no separation. You're not separate from your neighbor, which is what all the great religions teach. Love your neighbor as yourself, because he is yourself. So the experience is that you're not separate from one another. You're not a separate identity. You're not a separate being. You are one another. We're all Buddha. We're all Christ, which is pure Christian doctrine, by the way. Just one Christ. Loving himself. So when we begin to have that experience, what would that do for world peace? When people realized they were their neighbor. They were everybody. There's no such thing as an enemy, which is why Jesus says, "Love your enemies," because there aren't any. It's just you, but not the you that you thought you were. It's the Buddha, the Christ. So a very good, I have this on my shelf at home. It's a watercolor created by one of the disciples of my teacher, Roshi Kennedy. And he did the actual calligraphy. But it's a quote from Dogen, the founder of Japanese Zen. And it illustrates perfectly the point I'm making. He says, the true person, who you really are, is not anyone in particular, but like the deep blue color of the limitless sky. Didn't we just talk about vast and boundless like outer space? Like the true deep color of the limitless sky, it is everyone, everywhere in the world. That's the true person. That's the Buddha. That's the Christ. And as the koan says, it's you, Eiko. It's you, Mary. It's you, Joan. It's you, Joseph. It's you, Joan. And if you wake up and realize that all things have achieved the way at the same time, then you'll be able to say that. That true person is you, and it is everyone, everywhere in the world. By the way, of all times, not just now, but now in our temporal measurement of it, it's the eternal now, which is what you wake up to also. Time disappears. That's why it's everyone, everywhere. It's getting pretty heady, or pretty hardy, or whatever you want to say. Pretty amazing. A similar quote, I also have this on the next shelf over. Soar with eagle's joy. Can you imagine as you're soaring through this sky, vast and boundless, how liberating, how exciting, how energizing. There's a quote from the Upanishads. Little space within the heart is as great as the vast universe. The heavens and the earth are there, the sun and the moon and the stars, all things. Fire and lightning and winds are there, and all that now is and is not. That's there too. There was a interesting little exchange on an interfaith meeting I was at between a Hindu and a Buddhist contemporary. And, you know, talking about there's no Atman, there's no, according to the Hindus, you have the self, and there's no self in Buddhism, so, but of course, it ultimately came down to, well, we don't mean by Atman something you can define or limit or envision. It's no self in terms of anything that we know. It's actually, as you find in all religions, ultimately, when you get down to the bottom of it, there is no conflict. And what they're saying is they're just pointing in different ways to an insight, to an experience. But I'd like to conclude, well, especially with a quote from the Diamond Sutra, which speaks about the fact that there's no thing that you, like no Atma, no self that you can define or limit. Should there exist in the minds of bodhisattvas arbitrary conceptions of phenomena such as the existence of oneself, or the self of another, or the self that's divided into beings, or self that is unified into one universal self existing internally, they would be unworthy to be called bodhisattvas. So all these things are projections and limitations. That's why, which will get in the way of your experience, which is why the great masters say, no mind, no self, no Buddha. So it doesn't get in the way of your experience. And yet they call it the Diamond Sutra, which is something which is very firm and very clear and very strong. Like the Dorje in the Tibetan Buddhism, which is the diamond way. But I will conclude with a description of these selves. You know, the different ways of saying this. My teacher's teacher, Roshi Bernie Glassman, is one of the founders of American Zen in the 70s, put it this way: maybe we should not speak of no self. Maybe we should speak of or expanded self. So rather than trying to kill yourself or try and, because no self can get really psychologically tricky, speak of an expanded self, which is also psychologically tricky because then you become megalomaniac. But if you understand it in the right way, that it's not the self that sat down under the Bodhi tree, but the self that woke up the next morning, then that expansive self, vast and boundless as the whole universe, is what we mean. You can speak of self then, if that's what you mean. Not just no self, but self. Ordinary mind, the same way that koans do. You're safe because of the experience. And the same way Carl Jung, for example, spoke of ego versus self with a capital S. Exactly the same thing, really, when we get down to it. This fully realized, actualized self is what we're talking about here. We approach it psychologically. This is more spiritually. And I'll just end with a description of these two types of self. Another way of doing it is true self, false self. Some spiritual writers speak of it this way. Your false self is your ego-limited self, and your true self is the vast and boundless universe. And speak about Diamond Sutra. My favorite Christian author speaks about as the immortal diamond. That's your, not in the sense of limited, but in the sense of vast and beautiful and strong and full of light. But these are the bullet point descriptions of the two different selves. So it's not too abstract, but gets down to nitty-gritty. So your true self that we've been talking about is your absolute identity, the soul in the true sense, who you are in God, if you use theistic language, who God is in you, inherently satisfied and content. That's what happens in daily life. It's inherently satisfied and content. So if you're griping all the time, you're not there. Feels and is immortal. And then finally, the great self, the Christ self, the God self, the Buddha self, the branch connected to the vine. Use the image of Jesus. That's the real self. Then you are. Thou art, according to the Upanishads. Now listen to the description of the false self to see if you can find yourself here. It's your relative identity, not your absolute identity. It's your starter kit at life. And that's good, especially for your young people. You find your place in the world, you develop your ego, you find your career, you find maybe your marriage partner, you find your place in the world, you make your bank account, etc. That's all good, but it's just your starter kit. What's it all for once you've done that? The identity you created for yourself goes only so far. The self that changes and dies. So it's the self that gets old and gets sick and dies, but your true self doesn't. It's neither born nor dies, as the Buddhists say correctly. Inherently needy and fragile. So when you feel needy and fragile, that's your false self. I mean, it's real. But that's the dukkha, the insatisfaction of life that pushes you towards finding your true self. You live from the outside in instead of from the inside out, always reacting to good things or bad things as you define them around you. Is self-enclosed and self-referential. Everything's about you. It's dissatisfied and always reinventing itself because it's so partial. It's the small self before transformation, the branch cut off from the vine, the single grain of wheat. It's precisely your separate self as separate. That's the best definition of your false self. It's precisely your separate self as separate, and not as, well, bound to everything in the universe and to everyone in the universe. It's the illusion that must pass. So that's why we sit. We don't sit mainly to de-stress. We sit to overcome our illusions. And the basic illusion of our self, which is an illusion. No self. Sorry. No, I'm not sorry. It's great. We're free. Thank you. So I'll take some any questions or reactions or comments? There's a lot to take in.